Good morning, everyone. I would like to initiate the first panel, the licensing principle on financial services. Our keynote speaker for this panel will be Professor Christos Gortsos. Professor Christos Gortsos is a professor of public economic law at the Law School of the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens. He is also the Vice President of the Board of Appeal of the European Supervisory Authorities, the ESAs, and also the President of the Academic Board of the European Banking Institute, the EBI, who is our co-sponsor in this event. Professor Christos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, my dear colleague Diogo and dear Caterina, and welcome to all in this event. I realize it's well attended. I can just check that we have at least 65 attendees in the chat, which means that apart from those you can see, we have a lot of participants in on the web. And I must apologize that I cannot be with you. I was in Lisbon last week, but today I could not make it, even though I would love to be with you, since I have exams at my university and I will have to leave just after my brief introduction. It was with pleasure that we accepted at the European Banking Institute your proposal to co-organize this event, because as a matter of fact, it is touching upon a subject, an area, which is at the core of our activity. As you know, the European Banking Institute is a consortium of European universities, including from Portugal and other almost all member states of the European Union, but also from Switzerland, which is dealing with financial regulation. Our main cup of tea is banking regulation, but we also cover elements of capital markets regulation and insurance. And of course, Fintech is one of the topics which are very high on the agenda of our interest for 2 years now, at least. It is also extremely interesting, and I would love to listen to the presentations, and we will then apparently will have a book with all the presentations submitted to see how a faculty of private law and its members are dealing with a subject which is mainly, I would say, if you see it from the internal law, from the national law, mainly administrative law. But again, the interactions always between private and administrative law, public law, in this respect, are there. I was a young student at the university in the 80s when I was first interested in banking regulation. And that was in the mid-80s, in 1985, when I started thinking of writing a thesis on, at that time, international and European financial banking regulation, and how the one has influenced the other, how the European law had been influenced by international law. And as a matter of fact, I was preparing myself for today. I recalled that some of the first legal acts of the European Union, at that time, European Economic Community of banking and in general financial law, were dealing with the principle of licensing. Let me remind you, or tell you for those who are much, much younger and not dealing with the historical dimensions, that it was the first banking directive in 1977 already, which was a very lenient text, only 10, 12 articles, which set the conditions for credit institutions to get a license. So that was one of the main aspects of harmonization of law, even at that time. And then in 1985, we had the same principle for usage, with the directive of 611 of 85. And then some years later on investment firms by the grandparent of the MiFID II, the Investment Services Directive. And then in other areas of law, like in insurance, the same principle at the same time, then codified by the Solvency II. So the principle of licensing, the authorization of financial firms is one of the areas which is of interest to European legislation. And correctly so, because this is an aspect which is usually not so well attended, and the focus is not on that. But let me remind you that according to the theory of financial regulation and banking regulation, the authorization is the first element in prudence. It is a screening function to make sure that the conditions are there, and then in the course of supervision, they will be continuously on a continuous base followed in order to ensure the proper functioning of financial firms. Fintech is an area in which, as already mentioned, as already Diogo mentioned, is an area in which you may find entities which are not being licensed and they don't get an authorization. So to a certain extent, they may violate one of the golden rules in financial regulation, which is same business, same risks, same rules. So as a matter of fact, to the extent that financial intermediaries, fintech companies, are operating in the financial system, competing directly with supervised entities and with regulated entities which have got an operating license, it makes sense to require their submission to some prudential rules, including starting with their authorization by the usually then competent authorities, the authorities which will then continue to supervise them. We had this phenomenon. This phenomenon is not really a new one. We didn't speak about fintech in 2000 or in 1998, but we already had one financial animal which emerged and was not regulated, and that was the e-money institutions. And by the first directive, which did so in 2000, 2012, the e-money institutions at that time were set under the same rules initially as the credit institutions, and they were labeled as credit institutions. Yeah, there was a short period of time that e-money institutions were considered to be the second part of the definition of a credit institution. But then we had a special regulation for them. The same applied some years later with regard to the payment institutions, those who were competing with credit institutions, with banks, in the field of the provision of payment services. And then regulation for them was also required, including by licensing them. And we had the PSD, which was then amended, repealed by the PSD2, which is in force. Apparently, in our days, with the development of the technology and with the development of artificial intelligence and all the facilities which are provided by the blockchain technology, the situation is even more urgent. And it has become very topical to consider which type of institutions are operating in the financial sector and to regulate them and supervise them appropriately. Let me remind you that we still speak about shadow banking and shadow finance. This is another way to express the fact that you have these players operating in the system on an unequal regulatory basis if competing with regulated and supervised entities. And please allow me to remind you that shadow banking was one of the first issues that was addressed after the global financial crisis of 2007-2009. So this phenomenon is again not new. Nevertheless, as I said before, and as we all know, in the current situation, the need to regulate fintech has become predominant. And I understand that some sessions of your very interesting conference, in my view, will focus on that. And then we have a specific new element, which is the regulation of crypto assets and crypto asset providers. And we have legislation in the making. We have the MiCAR, which will submit all these different entities which are in the business of crypto assets, also under the licensing principle, and then under appropriate prudential regulation and supervision. And these are all aspects that you are going to deal with. So I think that your conference is very well articulated, starting with, as I understand it, with the status quo. What are the licensing requirements in banking? We have them already since 1977, but of course they have developed, even though the main principles, if you check that, remain the same. And the definition of the credit institution introduced by that directive almost remains the same. Then you go into the licensing principle in capital markets, which is even more interesting to the extent that in banking, you actually regulate and you license one entity, the bank, the credit institution. In capital markets, you have more players because you have the investment firms, you have the companies which are managing the various investment funds, starting from the UCITS and going to the alternative investment funds. You have the crowdfunding providers, the crowdfunding services providers. You have the credit rating agencies. You have so many players in capital markets which need to be licensed and then regulated and supervised. And then you go on with insurance in the first section, then dealing with fintech, then dealing with crypto assets, and then going into, I would say, the field which is more of private law, which has to do with smart contracts. One final remark I would like to make, I don't want to take more of your time because you have some excellent presentations to follow, is the fact that on the one hand, we need to make sure that all entities subject to the same risks are going to be licensed and regulated and supervised. But at the same time, we have a second aspect, which is equally important. Since 2010, let's say, we see a gradual move of some aspects of supervision, of licensing and then supervision at EU level. It started with the credit rating agencies, which are being supervised by European authorities, by the ESMA, and then the heavyweight, the SSM in the euro area. For the credit rating agencies in the internal market. For the SSM, it's in the euro area plus. You have also Croatia and Bulgaria and anyone who wishes to join, which has also been centralized under the ECB. On the other hand, you have insurance, you have other aspects of capital markets, including the investment firms and the management companies of funds, which are still being supervised at national level. The same applies to the payment institutions, to the e-money institutions, and the majority, I would say, of the companies which are offering services in the financial sector. So as a matter of fact, one aspect which is extremely important nowadays is this asymmetry in the level of supervision. While a very essential part of the financial sector is being supervised at centralized level, the rest remains in the hands of national authorities. And in my view, this asymmetry is one of the issues that need to be addressed in the years to come. Eventually, I gave you an idea for a next seminar that you would like to launch in the years to come. Thank you very much for the invitation to give these brief introductory remarks. I wish you all the best in your conference in the coming hours. I apologize again for not being with you because I would like very much to listen to all these great presentations, and I will be looking forward to see all these presentations in the format which will then be published. Thank you very much again, and good luck with your conference today.